Next, we're going to take a look at the obstacles that are in the way of third parties and their opportunities to succeed in elections. One of those big obstacles would be presidential debates. What we see here is a debate in 1992 between George Bush and Bill Clinton, and this is actually one of the rare times when a third party candidate has been allowed to participate in the debate. So that guy in the middle, standing in the back, is Ross Perot, one of our more famous third party candidates to run for president. So one of the many things in the way of third party candidates is like they don't even get to compete in debates. But here's an example of one time it happened. So let's look at what keeps the third parties from being able to compete fairly. The big thing in presidential elections that keeps third parties from being able to compete is that most of our states, almost all of our states, use the winner take all system of distributing electoral votes. That means that the person with the most votes gets all of the electoral votes. We know that much. Even if the election is close, even if a candidate does not get a majority of votes, they still get all of the electoral votes here. Runners up get nothing in the presidential elections, runners up get nothing in congressional elections here. So the thing is, third parties are likely to have some support. They could even have a lot of support in some places, but it's really unlikely that they're going to have the most support any place. So that means they'll never be able to get an electoral vote. That means they'll never be able to get a seat in Congress. They'll have a lot of support nationally, but they won't have the most support anywhere. Another problem for third parties is it's actually really difficult to get your name on the ballot. Every state has different requirements, and you have to do a lot of work to actually get on the ballot in those states so that you're an option in the race. The Republican and the Democratic parties, we talked, a couple days ago, they've been around for more than 150 years now. They're very organized. They're very organized in every place. So it's easy for them to make sure that their paperwork is complete. Third parties have a really hard time getting all that stuff done in all 50 states. It's really difficult paperwork. We've tried to do it as a class often in election years. We've tried to get Miss Holland on the ballot for president, and it's you have to get different signatures from all across the state. In the case of Tennessee, you have to have a couple thousand signatures of registered voters and all that, and it's very hard for third parties to be able to do this in every state. So they may be able to do it in some states, but not necessarily everywhere. Here, it's not important that you guys know these numbers, but just to see how this works. The Green Party and the Libertarian Party, they're actually pretty big and organized for minor parties. Like, they're definitely our two most regular minor parties and have the best organization of any of the parties. But you see here, the Green Party, in 2000, they were on a lot of ballots, but not all of them. And then they had a hard time getting on the ballot again in the next few elections. They got back to that same number in 2016. The Libertarian Party looks like it's a little more organized, but even the Libertarian Party has a hard time meeting the requirements in every election. So there's 3 elections in a row there where they did not make it on in all the states. We mentioned this at the beginning, but presidential debates are a big deal. You get a huge audience to watch those, and they've been a part of every party election since 1976. The 2 major party nominees have been in the televised presidential debates all of the elections here, and the voters count on this. The Republican and the Democrat automatically get to compete, but the third parties don't. The Commission on Presidential Debates, they have rules that would allow a third party to get in, but they have to be on like all of the state ballots, and that's hard to do. They also have to have, in polling, they have to have 15% support. And that's a problem for our third parties. Like, our third parties have some support everywhere, but 15% is a really high threshold, and so they don't usually qualify for the televised debates. The last thing here is just pretty sad. When we do see a third party that has like success and they do pick up a lot of support, the major parties just end up stealing their ideas. They steal their strategies. We talked about George Wallace a little bit. George Wallace ran as a segregationist. So he was running for president based mostly on segregation in 1968, and he got a lot of support. So in the next election, Richard Nixon adopted the Southern strategy, and he was able to appeal to voters in the same way to get the support of Southern white voters again. So this, this means that the Republican Party saw what George Wallace did that was successful, and then just stole his strategy. And that, made it even harder for a third party to compete. Why would you support the tiny party when the big party's doing the same thing? Ross Perot, as a candidate we'll talk about, he was always talking about the deficit. After he was pretty successful in 1992, both parties stole his idea. So Republicans and Democrats both focused a lot on the deficit in 1996 and 2000. Another thing we want to make sure we understand about minor parties is there are different types of minor parties. So we're going to go through a few different types here and give just a couple of examples. What you see in the picture here would be an example of a single issue party, one that runs all the time. We do still have a prohibition party in the United States, and they run candidates who promise to bring back the prohibition of alcohol. The first type of minor party would be an ideological party. These parties mean that they have their own ideology. They have their own set of core beliefs. They're based on a specific set of beliefs about how the government should operate. So a couple of examples here. We have the Socialist Party. This would be a very liberal party, advocates for socialism. We have the Libertarian Party, a very conservative party that advocates for minimum government. Just a couple of examples here, and we'll see some of these parties can fit into more than one category here, but this is what an ideological party means. It's basically the main kind of party that we think of, a party that has its own set of ideas about what the policies should be. Another really simple one is the single issue party. These parties are exactly what they sound like. They focus on one policy. The whole party is based around support for one particular issue or public policy. So we had talked a minute ago about the Prohibition Party. They run candidates who advocate for the prohibition of alcohol. Another party, we have the U.S. Marijuana Party. They run candidates for office. Their candidates only focus on the legalization of marijuana. One that you're probably more familiar with from history class, something like the Free Soil Party, was based only on ending slavery. We also have what we would call economic protest parties. These parties form because they're unhappy with both major parties. Like, they disagree with the economic policies of the country in general. They think Democrats and Republicans are both doing terrible things economically. And so they're economically focused and critical of both parties, usually for spending a lot of money or ignoring particular economic issues. We got a couple of examples here. The Populist Party was one in the late 1800s. They were advocating a lot for the economic interests of farmers, who they felt were being ignored by the Republicans and the Democrats. In the 2010s, we saw a small party pop up and eventually become part of the Republican Party, but what we call the Tea Party is kind of an example of this, because they were critical of Democrats because they're very conservative, but they were also critical of Republicans at the time, saying that the Republicans were spending way too much on government. A splinter party is a party that splits off of a major party. They end up campaigning on their own separately and running candidates against major parties here. They tend to be parties that are more liberal than Democrats or more conservative than Republicans. The Green Party split off of the Democrats way back in the 1970s because they thought the Democrats were not liberal enough. The Green Party is more liberal than Democrats. The Tea Party, or possibly like a Trump party, might split off because they're unhappy with the Republicans in office. There may be a split in the party in the future here, where we have more conservative Republicans split off from the Republican Party and actually run against both candidates. And then finally, we have candidate-centered parties. Candidate-centered parties are based around a candidate. They don't really have much else going on. They just kind of focus on one individual, and when that individual stops running, the party's pretty much over. We got an example of this with Ross Perot. We'll talk about him in a minute, but he ran in 1992, and he was really successful, so the party formed around him and ran in 1992 and in 1996, and when he stopped running for president, the party kind of fell apart. We're going to go through just a few examples of successful third-party campaigns. We're talking about presidential campaigns here, but we're going to talk about just a couple of examples of third parties that were pretty successful. Here, we're going to talk about him in a minute, but we've got our guy Ross Perot. He ran in both elections in the 1990s and was probably definitely the most successful modern third party candidate. We're going to start all the way back in 1948. So we're at like the end of a long time period of President Roosevelt in charge, and his vice president, President Truman, is running for re-election. So he's pushing for New Deal programs, and he's pushing for civil rights protection for African Americans. He's the Democrat. The Republicans, because the public is mostly still very supportive of the New Deal, the Republicans also nominated a liberal candidate in 1948. So you basically have two liberals running for office, and Strom Thurmond is a Democrat, but in South Carolina. So he splits off and starts his own party called the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats broke away from the Democratic Party, and their main platform was a platform of racial segregation. He was going to continue segregation and promote segregation policies, and he ended up winning 4 states. He got electoral votes for 4 southern states in 1948. This guy is a real monster. He ended up in the Senate. He was in the Senate until he was in his mid-90s. So he was our president pro tempore for a long time. But he ran a campaign based purely on racism and won 4 states. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson was not running for re-election. He chose to not run for re-election after his first full term. Richard Nixon was running, and he was using his Southern strategy to appeal to Southern white voters. So he was talking a lot about policies that would motivate people to vote for him based on a reaction to the Civil Rights Act that was passed by Lyndon Johnson. So George Wallace runs a campaign. He starts a party called the American Independent Party, and his campaign is all about getting rid of the Civil Rights Act and maintaining segregation in southern states. He ended up winning 5 states. He got electoral votes in 5 states in the South in 1968. So again, a candidate running based purely on being a racist finds a way to find success in American presidential elections. So far we've had 2 candidates running on platforms of racism, and they're able to capture electoral votes in southern states because their support is concentrated in one place. That's one of the ways that you can be successful. And then we got our guy Ross Perot. This is in the 1990s, and Ross Perot is like a billionaire. He can do this by himself. So he can like fund a party and all this kind of thing. But in the 1992 election, Ross Perot is running against George H.W. Bush, old George Bush, and Bill Clinton. George Bush is really a moderate among the Republicans. He's very moderate, and he was not nearly as conservative as a lot of people in the party. Bill Clinton, the Democrat, was running as what he called a new Democrat, meaning that he was also moderate. He and many Democrats had abandoned their support for liberal policies like social welfare programs. So you have 2 moderate candidates here, a moderate Republican versus a moderate Democrat, and Ross Perot is really conservative. He thinks that the focus needs to be on reducing the deficit and reducing the debt. He thinks that both parties are ignoring the issue and spending too much money. And so he ran a whole campaign based around spending and reducing spending and getting the government debt paid off. And he won almost 20% of the votes across the country. This is huge. He got so much support around the country, but he didn't have the most support in any place. So he ends up with no electoral votes, even though he got almost 20% of the votes for president. So this one probably played a little bit of a spoiler too. 20% of the votes went to Ross Perot, who was a really conservative guy. That might have been enough to help George W. Bush beat Bill Clinton in 1992. And then one we talked about a little earlier, Ralph Nader in 2000. Ralph Nader running as the Green Party candidate. Al Gore is the Democrat. George Bush is the Republican. Al Gore got the most votes nationally, but the state of Florida was very, very, very close. 500 vote margin for George Bush to win the state and win the presidential election. Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate here, won almost 100,000 votes in the state of Florida. So, since we can assume about half of those people would have been Gore voters, Gore would have won the election if not for Ralph Nader running in the state of Florida. So, these are big campaigns to know. These are our big third party examples where we can talk about like they actually had success in a presidential election. Ross Perot and Ralph Nader didn't end up getting any electoral votes, but they did get a significant number of votes from voters who liked their policies. Those older candidates, Strom Thurmond and George Wallace, like they're running campaigns based only on racism and segregation, and it's like embarrassing and sad, but they were able to win states in the South. All right, that's it for our look at third parties today. Little minor parties reminds us of our friend Lil Trump. So here's Lil Trump sitting here talking to Obama, and Lil Trump is just so adorable in his big boy chair. Pretty simple stuff we want to make sure we can do today. We want to make sure we can describe the effects of third parties. We want to make sure we can describe the different types of third parties, probably even give examples of third parties. Of all those third parties that we talked about, I think it might be easiest to explain the 2000 election. So I would make sure I remembered how that worked in case we have to answer questions about the impact of third parties on elections. So remember the spoiler role. So we want to make sure we can explain how the third parties might have impacted the 2000 election, and that's it. So we want to take a look at the roles that third parties play, and make sure that we can explain that even though they're not winning elections, they do still have important political impacts. And that's it for third parties, and that's really it for political parties too. We've been through a lot of stuff about political parties and what they do and why they are important linkages for voters and the government. So now we're going to shift to a very closely related linkage institution. We're going to look at elections themselves. Elections serve as a link between the people and the government too, and this is the place where political parties are most prominent. So we're going to shift over and start to look at how elections link people to the government.